So, I recently finished the Halo 3 campaign, having already revisited the first two Halo games as part of the Master Chief Collection on Steam. Gamers of a certain age, like myself, will no doubt be able to recall the blockbuster impact of these era-defining games in their 2000s heyday. Like almost every millennial gamer who lived their 20s in that decade, Halo holds a significant place in my own personal gaming history. So rediscovering these games after such a long passage of time was an interesting experience. As an OG fan of the series, could I honestly say these games still hold up today, or do they belong in a different era and are best left there? And what would gamers with no history or connection to these games make of them now, in the new age of shooters like Doom Eternal? But I knew I shouldn't just examine these games in isolation. Context is important too. I don't think anyone would deny these games were titans of their time, so a full discussion should consider why these games mattered, as well as how they play now. As I began to dig into the history of Halos 1, 2 and 3, I discovered that the story of their development is a fascinating tale in itself, with many of the team at Bungie and Microsoft making no secret of the extraordinarily difficult journey they had with all three games in this first Halo trilogy. So before we get into the games themselves, let's wind the clock back 20 years and see how it all began. Bungie was already a moderately successful games developer by the time they began work on the title that would eventually become Halo. They had produced Myth, an award-winning strategy game, and Halo had been conceived as another strategy title with a sci-fi setting. This new strategy game would be fully 3D and allow players to view the action up close and personal with the troops under your control. Many of the vehicles were in the game from the very beginning, including the most iconic Halo vehicle.
Somebody order a Warthog!
It was in fact the Warthog that convinced Bungie to make the switch from strategy to first-person shooter. One of the team had developed a mode of attaching a camera to one of your units, and the team had so much fun viewing the action as the Warthog's driver just tearing around over the terrain that they realised that the game should not be strategy-based. It wasn't Bungie's first-person shooter either. They had already developed Marathon for the Mac a few years earlier, and Halo was going to be a Mac game until the studio was bought by Microsoft, and it then became a launch title for the original Xbox. The PlayStation 2 was already out, and well on its way to becoming the most successful console ever, so the Xbox needed something big to be its USP. Of course, it's easy now to see Halo as exactly what they needed, but things were a lot less certain during its development. First-person shooters just weren't really done on console at that time. There was only really one successful example up to that point. The Xbox's other launch titles didn't have the kind of mass-market appeal needed to tempt people away from the PlayStation 2, so its success largely depended upon Halo. Microsoft's games division was also still new and regarded as something of a joke by the other parts of the business. So if Halo didn't succeed, there may well have been no more Xboxes as well as no more Halos. The pressure to get the game finished in time for the Xbox's launch in late 2001 became intense as time went on, and the whole multiplayer element of the game was nearly dropped as a result. Just imagine how different game history might have been if that had happened. The game was in its final stages of development when 9/11 occurred. By that point, the team were working flat out, 7 days a week. The game's audio director, Martin O'Donnelly, recalled that after the attacks had happened, he called a colleague to check on them, and was shocked to be told that he was already at the office working as if nothing had happened. Martin asked who else was there and was told, everyone. The pressure to get the game done had reached such a point where the staff believed they couldn't take any time off, not even on 9/11. O'Donnelly said that he had to go to the office and send the team home to be with their families. Halo was released a few weeks later and was a huge success, but the effort had taken such a toll that a lot of the team took long sabbaticals after it shipped. Jason Jones, a founder member of Bungie and the game's project lead, was said to be particularly affected and in poor health. Of course, today we are much more aware of what it was the team had gone through. Crunch. This dreadful practice of effectively coercing development staff to work near continuously on a project in order to meet some expected and often arbitrary deadline has received a lot of exposure in recent years, and it is sad that the practice seems to be in rude health just as much today as it was 20 years ago on Halo. But that is a topic that deserves its own video and is for another time. Although Bungie did not originally plan to do a sequel to Halo, a lot of what they had envisaged for the game was cut due to a lack of time, which left plenty of ideas to explore in a follow-up. The success of Halo also ensured that work on the sequel started fairly quickly. Unfortunately for Bungie, development of Halo 2 would turn out to be even worse than the first game. The problems with Halo 2 started almost immediately and were apparently caused by a lack of clear leadership. Bungie had expanded from a staff of 15 at the beginning of Halo to around 60 at the start of Halo 2, but a lot of the work was done in small, private teams with no effective communication between them. Good progress was made on the multiplayer side of things, which was being handled by a single crew. Work on the single-player campaign was a different story, however, being torn in different directions by people with their own ideas of how it should be.
Under Miranda Keys.
For the story, Jason Jones originally wanted Mira Keys to be a villain that tries to kill Master Chief. Jones clashed with Joe Staten, the game's main writer, and they had long, often fraught conversations with each other about the direction the game should go in. One of those new directions that did make the final product was the switch, at various points, to the Arbiter, a new playable character from the other side of the fence. Although this enabled Bungie to develop the Covenant beyond the simple bad guys of the first game, it massively expanded the sequel's scope beyond simply just the ideas that they had had to cut. The Arbiter was also divisive, with several of the senior staff feeling that switching the gameplay to this new character was not an exciting mechanic and instead illustrated how far the game was beginning to lose its way from what they had originally intended it to be. To make matters more challenging, Bungie's original founder, Alex Seropian, left the studio at this time, as he wanted to do something new and it had become clear to him that Bungie was just becoming a Halo studio. After he left, the leadership problems grew worse. Halo 2 wasn't the only game Bungie was working on. There was another title called Phoenix that wasn't making good progress. Jason Jones felt bad for the Phoenix team, whose morale was low, and wanted to help them complete their game. So he moved over to them, bringing along some of his own crew. That's correct. The project lead of Halo 2, the Xbox's most important game, left Halo 2 halfway through its development to work on something else. Needless to say, this did not go over well with the remaining staff on Halo 2, which now had to fill the gap left by their departing colleagues. New talent was brought in, but they were raw and needed to be managed. Therefore, many of the game's designers who would normally just work on creative output now find themselves having to act as managers and team leads, whilst at the same time having to continue their creative work. The production was in a mess. They did, however, manage to produce a playable demo for the 2003 E3 show that went over incredibly well and became a legendary example of how to build excitement for a game. No mean feat, given that Doom 3 and Half-Life 2 both previewed the same year.
I don't say the word awesome. Usually dude doesn't come out of my mouth. But the truth is, the game is awesome, dude.
Just listen to this crowd reaction for this simple act of dual wielding.
Take cover!
Simpler times. The demo was fully playable and used a new graphics engine called P-Stencil that featured a revolutionary new lighting and shadow system for the time. Unfortunately for Bungie, they soon realised the tech couldn't be used for the whole game, because the system demands it created made the game simply unplayable. A lot of tricks were used for the E3 demo that simply couldn't be repeated for the entire game. That meant they had to throw it all out and start all over again. After more than a year of work, they were forced into a complete redesign of the game's campaign. At this point, the Phoenix team plus any others that weren't working on Halo 2 were brought over to help with Halo 2, and everything else was abandoned. It was all hands on deck, as the game was now in chaos. The levels were redesigned using whiteboards to quickly map out the story beats and action beats for each mission. Playing catch-up at breakneck speed on a year's worth of work meant nothing was written down or saved in digital documents, so the missions were mapped out only on the whiteboards, and if anything got erased from the boards, it was gone for good. The only backups they had were digital photographs they took of the whiteboards. You can't make it up. At this time, tensions were running high, both within Bungie and between Bungie and Microsoft. The Xbox leadership team came close to forcing Bungie to ship the game in time for the launch of Xbox Live, a year before the title was ready. They only backed down after the head of Microsoft Game Studios, Ed Freeze, threatened to resign if the extra time wasn't given to the studio.
Should we force Bungie to ship on the original schedule because Halo is so important to the company, or should we give them the extra year that they want? Every person in the room voted we should force them to ship on the original schedule.
These guys don't see
except for me. Yeah. And I walked out of the room and I said, I will quit now if we don't give them this extra year.
6 months later, Freeze left the job anyway. Times had changed. Microsoft's game division had largely been left alone in its early days, but corporate demands were becoming increasingly important in the wake of Halo's extraordinary success, and perhaps Freeze also knew that threatening to resign is a card that he could only really play once. Despite the extra time given, the entire third act of the game still had to be cut. Much of what had been mapped out for the intended finale would find its way into Halo 3, such as the Arbiter teaming up with Master Chief to discover the Ark and defeat the Prophet of Truth. The finale the game actually ended up with was further evidence of the poor leadership that had plagued the project from the beginning. You don't even play as Master Chief, the series' protagonist, in the game's final playable level. Instead, after you finish the game, the action cuts back to Master Chief arriving at Earth to say, completely unironically,
"Sir, finishing this fight."
And then the credits start rolling. This disjointed and obtuse ending left many of the team horrified at the complete lack of resolution it offered that they knew would frustrate or even infuriate their fans. But, having worked themselves to the point of destruction, they were left with no other option. Microsoft and Bungie made a behind-the-scenes documentary about Halo 2, which can be seen on YouTube and is mostly fairly standard promotional fluff, but does provide some interesting moments in light of the awfulness the team would later admit they endured during that time in their lives. The video presents the team as dedicated and committed to making the best game possible, which of course they were, but you occasionally see glimpses of the true situation, such as this surprisingly frank admission by Jason Jones.
This game sure wouldn't be what it is going to be if we had worked 8 hours a day, and maybe that sucks because we didn't plan right, and maybe there's a way to do it all on the 9-to-5 schedule, and maybe one day we'll even find that, but it's sure not the way it's going to be this time.
After Halo 2 shipped, Jones departed for a long time, and no one was sure if he would return. After working himself nearly to death not once but twice, Jones wasn't even sure if he wanted to make games anymore. He did eventually return to Bungie, but he would no longer be a project lead on any further Halo games. The experience of making Halo 2 had been so terrible that for a time it was unclear whether Bungie would actually continue together. The possibility of splitting apart was very real. Working relationships had been strained to breaking point and no one wanted to go through something like that again. But after some time away, The team were determined to make Halo 3 for the fans and finally deliver the intended conclusion to the story arc they had started in the first game. But Bungie faced a whole new set of problems, including new leadership, as Jason Jones had already left the scene. Plus the team was pretty fatigued with making Halo at that point, and everyone wanted Halo 3 to be the last game in the series. By that time, a change of console generation was occurring, and the team knew the final chapter of Master Chief's story would be on Microsoft's new platform, the Xbox 360. The 360 was the first high-definition console, so as well as getting to grips with programming for a new console, all of the graphical assets had to be recreated for the extra level of detail that could now be displayed.
The biggest challenge in front of us was how were we going to convert these assets from Halo 2 into this next-gen HD content.
I don't think there are any developers who are happy that it's a high-def world now. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just a pain in the ass for all of us.
In addition, Microsoft had completely rebuilt Xbox Live without Bungie's involvement, so a large part of the work on the multiplayer side of things was simply to enable the game to function with the new and improved live service. As a result, it was difficult to make any new innovations, especially since many staff resisted attempts to get them to take on extra work after the experience they had on Halo 2. Attitudes had changed from, yeah, we can find a way to do this, somehow, to, don't you remember what happened the last time? A more significant issue arose when the chief writer of Halo scripts, Joseph Staten, had a massive falling out with the game's art director, Marcus Leto, which was so poisonous that they couldn't work together any longer. Staten decided to take a break from the company, which left Halo 3 without a clear writer. Story committees were set up to construct the narrative, which went about as well as you can imagine a story created by committee would go. A lot of people had story ideas that they thought were cool, but they couldn't provide clear justifications why their ideas should be used, so instead they just argued really forcefully, hoping that that would do the trick, but all it did was cause shouting matches.
We had been working on this story non-stop, making compromise after compromise because there were a lot of things that different people didn't agree on. We write the first draft of the script, but it's not great. Man, do I really want to give all this credit to Marty?
I didn't see any shape to this story. Nothing happy, nothing sad, nothing intense.
Staten did return to the project, but by then most of the narrative had already been worked out and he did not react well to some of the choices taken. Staten was horrified at the decision to kill off fan-favourite character Sergeant Johnson, which had come from Martin O'Donnell, the series composer, who, after watching the film Serenity, had decided that major characters needed to be sacrificed in order to make the game's climax more impactful. By this point, Bungie had expanded to around 80 staff, and many of the original designers were no longer doing much creative work, as the demands of project leadership kept them in constant meetings. Nonetheless, progress was a lot smoother compared to the previous two titles. Many of the senior staff at Bungie, who were still young guys at this point, learned how to delegate tasks instead of thinking they could take on everything themselves as they had on Halo 2. Halo 3 released in 2007 and made $170 million on its first day of release. By the end of its first week, it had raked in more than $300 million. Despite its incredible success, many of the team wanted to move on from Halo, and from Microsoft. Halo had become the Xbox's golden goose, and they could see that Bungie would be a Halo factory as long as they remained under Microsoft's control. They struck a deal that would see Bungie leave and become independent once again, although they had to deliver a couple more Halo games in return for Microsoft letting them go, plus Microsoft would retain ownership of the IP, with further games in the franchise being developed by 343 Industries, an in-house studio created by Microsoft after the exit agreement with Bungie was signed. The last game Bungie produced in the series was Halo Reach in 2010, and then they were free to pursue their own destiny. Did you see what I did there? Yeah? Yeah, you got it. So that was the story of how the first Halo trilogy got made. A tale of eager, driven, and undeniably talented young guys creating a cultural phenomenon, but nearly ruining themselves in the process. Talk about suffering for your art. Of course the games were monumentally successful at the time of their release, but is it fair to say that they were of their time and should probably be left there? Or could they still appeal to young Gen Zers and later generations to come as much as they did to us aging millennials? As an OG fan of the series, I played Halo to completion many times in the early 2000s, but it must have been at least 15 years since I played it last. It's a strange feeling rediscovering an old title you used to be so familiar with, as some aspects of the gameplay immediately came back to me as if the last time I played it was yesterday. Whereas other parts of the gameplay now seem baffling to my middle-aged mind. Was the Warthog always this slidey and hard to control? It should be noted that Halo introduced, or at the very least popularized, some mechanics that would go on to become industry standards after it, such as replacing quick saves with autosave checkpoints, limiting the character to 2 weapons, and, of course, recharging health. The death of health packs in shooters has often been attributed to Halo, which is perhaps slightly ironic, since the first Halo still includes health packs, although admittedly they were removed in later games. In Halo, the recharging health made sense, because it is the Master Chief's personal shield that is recharging, and you can even see this happening in the third-person view. The adoption of health regen in military shooters like Call of Duty never made sense to me, as a hail of bullets to the face just became a temporary inconvenience that resolved itself, which made your character seem less like an ordinary soldier and more like the T-1000 from Terminator 2. But I digress. Some of the developments Halo made were not so much deliberate creative choices, but necessary ones, imposed by the hardware limitations of the original Xbox plus the limited time they had to produce the game. I remember feeling gypped the first time I played Halo and discovered you can only hold 2 weapons, and my housemate at the time arguing this was more realistic than previous shooters that let you carry an entire arsenal. I must admit, it was somewhat satisfying to find out this was in fact due to console limitations and not because of any desire for realism. One gameplay mechanic that remains a brilliant development, however, is the separation of your grenades from your guns. Being able to toss grenades in the heat of a firefight without having to select them from your main weapon inventory is one of those strokes of genius that makes you wonder why it wasn't done before. Even Half-Life didn't do that. It goes without saying that virtually every shooter since then has incorporated this mechanic, and it's now hard to imagine it not being used. And yet, in other ways, the first Halo has dated badly, which is to be expected after 2 decades. The anniversary edition included in the Master Chief Collection adds a shiny new coat of graphical paint, but it can't update the level design. Once upon a time, Halo's levels felt expansive in a way that was fresh and exciting, giving players gigantic open spaces that really felt new in 2001 compared to the restricted corridor shooters of the 90s. But now, the levels feel strangely barren and unnecessarily large, functioning essentially as playgrounds to roam around in the game's multitudinous vehicles. There isn't any clear signposting, and the minimap, if you can call it that, is basically useless, so I can imagine that new players will find it easy to get lost, particularly in the sections where, and there are a few of them, in order to find the next part of the level you first have to double back part of the way you came. Nevertheless, fighting against the Covenant is still fun. Back in 2001, the Covenant were notable for how responsive they were, seeking cover, throwing grenades, dodging the grenades you threw at them, and fighting differently whether you were close in or shooting from range. The AI was a big step forward at the time and still isn't bad 2 decades on. That's why it's still so vexing when the action shifts from the Covenant to the Flood. I'm just gonna say it, the Flood are garbage enemies. All of the behaviour that made the Covenant interesting to fight against is absent from the Flood, as they attack you in the same way every time, by charging straight at you. The most notorious level is the Library, which sees you fight wave after seemingly endless wave of Flood, with no strategy beyond simply keeping the trigger depressed until everything stops moving. This is where the game really suffers compared to modern shooters, as Master Chief's abilities are limited, there are no big set piece moments so the action gets stale, and every part of the level looks identical, making it very easy to lose your bearings in the drab, monotone surroundings. Most of this level feels like a copy and paste job. Overall, Halo Combat Evolved is okay to play now, but I would imagine that new players discovering it in the 2020s and unfamiliar with its legacy may wonder why such a fuss was made about it.
Do you know who I am?
No, I can't say that I do.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
Really?
People know me.
Well, I'm very happy for you.
Hopefully this video will give those people some idea of why Halo was kind of a big deal at the time, even if it has lost some of its luster. Halo 2 really expands on the lore of the universe, particularly the Covenant and the different races within it, which essentially make up a caste system, with the prophets and elites at the top and the grunts and brutes lower down, at least at first. The Arbiter's discovery of the Halo Ring's true purpose and the schism this causes within the Covenant always was the most interesting part of the game's story for me, as he's the only character that seems to have something like an arc. Master Chief is cool and all, but let's face it, he is a fairly standard superhuman hero that looks badass, says cool lines, but also essentially does what Cortana and his superiors tell him to do.
He is a husk. He's a big green suit of armor that you move around.
The Arbiter has his entire worldview shattered, like a cult member finally coming to terms with the fact they've been lied to their entire life. Some of Bungie's staff may not have liked the Arbiter initially, as I covered earlier, but I think his story of realization and rebellion added some much needed depth to the Covenant that made them a lot more interesting than the simple, almost goofy enemies of the first game. This is also where the updated Anniversary Edition of Halo 2 really stands out as an excellent example of how to remaster a game, as the original and now fairly janky game engine cutscenes have been replaced with pre-rendered cinematic movies that really give these space opera moments a suitable level of epicness. Most impressively, the ability to switch between old and new graphics still works during the cutscenes, so you can swap out the cinematic flair of the new movies with the janky originals and experience the game like we first did in 2004, if you really want to. The Anniversary Edition also includes special hidden terminals that activate additional movies that fill in the backstory of how Guilty Spark came into contact with the Renegade elites. It fills in some of the blank spaces they didn't have time for originally, and it works pretty well. Gameplay-wise, Halo 2 makes a number of improvements over the original. The levels are not as expansive, but are more varied and easier to navigate. Back in 2004, a lot of noise was made over the ability to dual wield and use the Elite's energy sword, but in practice those additions don't really make much difference, especially now with the passage of time. There's no doubt they were a great marketing tool, but I still found myself using the battle rifle and Covenant carbine more than anything else. I do remember the energy sword being a major advantage in multiplayer back in the day, but I didn't find it all that useful in the campaign during my recent playthrough, since you can only hit one enemy at a time and the others can and will quickly swarm over you.
Don't shake the light bulb.
For me, the last level of Halo 2 will always be Bungie's folly. The prime example of how badly mismanaged the project was, with a notorious non-ending that gamers had to wait another 3 years to see resolved. But now, with all of Bungie's Halo titles included in the Master Chief Collection, it's easy to think that new gamers will see it as just the end of the second chapter, before immediately loading up the third. It's funny to think that an ending that caused so much heartache for the developers and annoyance for the fans in 2004 could now be seen as no more problematic than the end of a single episode in a Netflix binge. I guess time does heal all wounds. It's still a shit ending though. This brings us to Halo 3, which I think has the best campaign of the trilogy, in terms of gameplay. This is when Halo really hit its stride and is still a lot of fun to play today. It's a shame then that it's just too damn short, clocking in at maybe half the length of the first 2 games. It may have been over too quickly, but at least it was still memorable. As you might expect, it picks up exactly where Halo 2 left off, and wastes no time throwing you right into the action. The combat is similar to Halo 2, but you now have single-use special items, such as the bubble shield, invincibility, and cloak. These special items help you tailor the gameplay to suit your own preferred style. Do you want to set up deployable cover and snipe from a distance, for example? Or rush forward with invincibility and batter your enemies hand to hand like a berserker? I often chose the latter option, since Halo 3 also introduces perhaps the most fun weapon in the Halo-verse, the gravity hammer. Unlike the energy sword, the gravity hammer is an area effect weapon, and is somewhat overpowered. Okay, it's actually quite a lot OP. But there is a cathartic joy in just being able to dash around swatting everyone aside as the biggest badass in the room, which anyone who has played the recent Doom games will recognise. Those titles have taken that kind of aggressive run and smash gameplay to delirious new extremes, and Halo 3's melee combat now seems simplistic next to the lurid glory kills of the Doomslayer. But I never felt so much like Thor as I did leaping down from a high vantage point to send everyone flying with a well-timed hammer blow. Plus, it's funny to hear the little grunts run away in fear yelling, "Ah, he's got a hammer!" That's right, you'd better run. Halo 3 also has some brilliant set-piece battles involving the Scarab weapons. There was just a single Scarab encounter in Halo 2,
but it was very scripted.
The way it was actually implemented in the game was boring as hell.
The Scarab in Halo 3 is an independent AI-controlled unit, so they are used multiple times in a series of escalating encounters that includes a glorious tank battle that was the first large-scale armoured fight in a Halo game. Everyone remembers the 2 Scarab finale, but I think the tank battle in the chapter The Ark is my personal favourite, as it felt like you were taking part in an epic confrontation between 2 opposing forces, rather than just the linear tank sections of previous games that mostly presented a conveyor belt of things to shoot. Master Chief has always been the unstoppable hero that did everything on his own, so feeling like you were just a single tank commander in a much larger battle where not everything that happens is the direct result of your own actions was a welcome departure from the norm. The one disappointing level of Halo 3 is near the end, where you fight off the Flood to save Cortana. This did nothing to alter my view of the Flood as garbage enemies that aren't particularly fun or interesting to fight. The Flood look horrible, not in a hard to look at grotesque kind of way, but more of a bland, beige coloured sort of way that doesn't provoke any feelings beyond mild irritation. Which is not what you want from enemies that are meant to be so deadly that entire continents are sacrificed to stop them. It also didn't help to have the game stop the action dead multiple times just so that the Gravemind can shout something inane at you, like some kind of annoying housemate randomly hitting the pause button and sneering while you're trying to watch Face Off. Returning to the visuals for just a moment, which are certainly a step up from the first 2 games as you'd expect given the change of console generation that occurred between Halo 2 and 3, and certainly don't look bad today on a modern ultra-wide PC monitor. Nevertheless, those 2020's resolutions also make clear a surprising amount of jankiness that I don't remember the first time I played the game back in 2007, but immediately stand out now. In particular, all of the human characters look really quite bad. It may seem churlish to criticise such an old game for its graphics, but for comparison, Modern Warfare was released the same year on the same console, and its characters looked like this. Yeesh. Halo 3's ending wasn't at all bad. It seemed to deliberately echo the way the first game ended, and not just with the ticking clock mad warthog dash that capped both games, but also with Master Chief and Cortana once again being left alone in space, waiting until they are discovered or needed again. The elites and humans make peace, the prophets are dead, and the threat of the Halo rings and the Flood are seemingly ended, and we finally get the resolution we had been waiting for. It's a fitting end to the first trilogy of the Halo saga that leaves just enough room for Master Chief to return at some point. The original Xbox never reached anything like the lofty sales heights of the PlayStation 2, the console that dominated the early to mid-2000s in a way that no other console has done before or since. But it did give us the Halo franchise, which turned out to be not just the killer app the Xbox needed, but also had an impact on the industry that far exceeded the relatively modest success of its parent platform. Until Halo, first-person shooters were as much of a PC genre as strategy games were. The success of Halo firmly established that shooters not only could work on a console, but thrive, eventually even overtaking the PC to become the platform of choice for millions of gamers, perhaps for the easy way that you could set up multiplayer sessions with your housemates, sharing beer, pizza and joints while you tried to murder each other in split screen on your giant 21-inch CRT Trinitron TVs. Although the Halo franchise continued after the first trilogy, its cultural impact has never really reached the same heights that it did in that first decade. That is only natural, since there is a lot more competition in the shooter space now. Yet the console shooters that came afterwards built upon Halo's success and arguably wouldn't have emerged without it. Halo's success is even more extraordinary considering that Bungie seemed to be flying by the seat of their pants for most of the time they were working on those games. Halo was superseded by the Call of Duty juggernaut that emerged in the latter half of the 2000s, but I for one am glad that it never turned into the dubious conveyor belt of annual iterations with increasing price tags and diminishing returns that COD did. As a result, I am genuinely looking forward to seeing what Halo Infinite delivers, and I hope that it does well. Until then, there's a few more Halo adventures in the Master Chief Collection to keep me occupied. All together now? Da-da-da-dun, 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 da-da-da-dun.